Welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.
Welcome. I'm Kelly Ash, Research Associate for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. Last week, we released our report exploring how the pandemic has impacted jobs and the workforce in rural Minnesota. And on this episode, we get to dive in a bit deeper into this topic with a couple of our workforce development boards and a labor analyst with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development in rural Minnesota. The workforce development boards indeed play a crucial role in the construction of Minnesota's workforce system. I like to think of them as curators of our workforce development resources. There are 16 areas in Minnesota, and each with their own workforce development board. They curate the resources coming into our regions so that they align with the unique workforce development needs in each region of rural Minnesota. This includes the development of unique programs to retrain unemployed and dislocated workers, to the development of high school classes that provide young people an opportunity to explore careers in their region, and partnerships with local businesses to assist them in the development of their own training programs. The unique direction of each workforce development board is driven by employers in the region, since they must, by federal law, make up a majority of the board of directors for each board. On today's episode, we get an opportunity to chat with two of these workforce development boards. Carrie Bendix, who is the executive director of the Southwest Minnesota Private Industry Council, and Vicki Leaderbrand, who is the executive director of the Rural Concentrated Employment Program, which serves counties in north central Minnesota. We also get to talk to Luke Greiner, regional analyst from the Minnesota Department of Economic Development, who serves central and southwest Minnesota. Hi, and welcome to the Center of Everywhere. I'm Kelly Ash, research associate with the Center for Rural Policy and Development. Today, we're talking about the impacts the pandemic has had on rural jobs and the workforce. It was only a year ago that rural Minnesota is facing a significant workforce shortage due to economic growth, demographic changes, and historically low unemployment. Our workforce development organizations in the state were scrambling to find workers. Then the pandemic hit, and now the landscape has changed. We at the Center, in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, just released a report looking into how the landscape has changed. And the big takeaways? Well, unemployment has increased, but it's concentrated in a few occupations that were hardest hit by the pandemic. Occupations such as food preparation and serving related, sales, and office administrative support. However, there is still significant workforce shortage in many other industries and occupations. This presents an opportunity for workforce development organizations. It's been years since they've had access to a pool of labor to tap for employers seeking workers. However, the pandemic does add a layer of complexity to all of this. For example, how do we engage these folks in a time when everything is in a virtual setting? With me today, we have three individuals who I rely on a ton for advice and perspective and interpretation of data for my research. I have Carrie Bendix, who's the executive director of the Southwest Minnesota Private Industry Council.
Hi, thank you for the invitation to be part of the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And Vicki Leaderbrand, executive director of the Rural Concentrated Employment Program up in northern Minnesota. Hi, Vicki.
Hi, good morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. And thanks also to you, Kelly, for the invitation.
You bet. And I have Luke Greiner, who's the regional analyst for Central and Southwest Minnesota and alumni of Hancock High School, my alma mater as well. Hi, Luke.
Hey, how you doing, Kelly? It is great to connect with somebody that knows where Hancock is.
Yeah, I hear you, man. It's pretty unique. Well, thanks, guys, for joining us. And we're going to launch right into the discussion here, talking about what impacts have you guys seen the pandemic have in your region regarding job availability and workers? And Carrie, I know in Southwest Minnesota, you guys are in the news quite a bit about still continuing to have the lowest unemployment in the state. But I'm sure there's some nuances there that the pandemic has. Can you explain a little bit about what you're seeing in your organization and your region of the state?
Well, Kelly, I definitely feel the low unemployment rates. In our region, we're predominantly agriculture, manufacturing, and healthcare positions. So when the stay-at-home orders were issued due to COVID-19, most of our jobs were essential jobs. So our unemployment rate never skyrocketed like you saw, to the same extent that you saw maybe in the metro or in other areas of the state. We also border South Dakota and Iowa, both states that never really issued a stay-at-home order. And we have residents in Minnesota who work in those states. So our unemployment rate was never really impacted. We see employers actually, when it first hit, they had to maybe shut down for a couple weeks, the large manufacturing or food production plants, to put the safety protocols in place. And then they brought back the employees for the most part, maybe not at 100% capacity, but they've been building on that since. So our unemployment rate still continues to be quite high. Most employers are talking about a labor shortage. There's a number of older residents who were working, who are at or nearing retirement age, who decided to retire. And with the school districts going to remote learning, there's a lot of parents of young children who, at least one of the parents, have decided to leave the labor force, and so employers are really struggling to not only recruit but to also retain their employees, and that's what we're hearing as one of the top concerns that they have. We've also seen that I was talking with someone who worked at a manufacturing plant, and even at their staffing levels being relatively full, they were still operating at 50% staffing because of so many workers needing to be in quarantine or had contracted COVID. And so just that revolving door within your staff of employees in and out has caused some employers to really struggle to maintain the same level of productivity.
Yeah, that was definitely something we saw in the data as well, as this idea you have unemployment. And I think it's a lot of people kind of misunderstand what is unemployment and who's included in that, right? Because then you start talking about who's participating in the labor force. And if you're getting unemployment benefits, you're still participating in the labor force, right? But this pandemic has introduced a kind of a unique wrinkle in all of this, is that we've seen some big changes in the trends of people participating in the labor force. Essentially, people choosing not to work right now for various reasons, as you laid out. They don't feel safe going to work. They have to stay home with kids, things like that. And that's like an added wrinkle to this whole situation that's pretty unique to the pandemic and not much like a typical recession. Is that kind of how you feel, Carrie?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Vicki, you're in northern Minnesota, a region of the state that your region in particular is really interesting because you have a little bit more traditional agriculture parts of your region, but then you have parts of your region that gets into like the northern woods, recreation, tourism, that maybe has a little bit more of the bars and restaurants and the industries that have been significantly impacted by the pandemic. What are you seeing in your region, and how does that add some complexity?
We're actually seeing very much what Carrie is seeing. We are seeing small business especially being hit hard, and in the hospitality industry was really hit hard. What was interesting when I'm going to refer to it as the Great Shutdown started, a lot of folks who have cabins and recreational areas in our area came up from the metro and quarantined up here, because with technology, they could work from home. So anyway, getting back to that, restaurants, bars, theaters, hotels, tourism all took a big hit. And I think we're finding overall that the majority of the industries and sectors that were hit the hardest lie in those areas. But we've also seen that fear is an overarching factor. You know, people are afraid to go back to work for fear of being exposed to the virus, or of even losing their job again, because especially in the hospitality industry right now, their jobs are kind of unstable because, you know, 1 month there might be a shutdown, the next month it's, you know, opening again to a certain capacity and that sort of thing, you know, or other regulations restricting business. Interestingly, Carrie and my area are very similar in that we also touch bordering states. We touch both North and South Dakota. We also touch Canada. So we operate in a very large area of Minnesota, where most of our, while we do have metro, for example, Bemidji and Brainerd and the Fargo-Moorhead area, but a lot of our area is actually not just rural, but actually very remote. And as the pandemic has caused us all to change the way we do business, we've depended more and more on technology. And I think it's very important to understand that in the rural areas, especially in our more remote areas, broadband is very spotty if it exists at all. And and for many of us who can work at home, if we're lucky enough to have good broadband, that's wonderful. But it's and the same thing with distance learning from K through 12 and up into college. The need for distance learning has been very strong, and that is also difficult. So we need to take a look at not just one factor, but there are many factors affecting the workforce. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is, and you alluded to it earlier, is the number of people who are absolutely now dropping out of the labor force. And what we're finding is in the rural areas, childcare is hard to find anyway. But especially as schools have gone to distance learning, we're finding that parents have had to drop out of the labor force in order to stay home and help homeschool their kids, or help them with the technologies. We're also finding that some of the incentives that have been put in place for the protection of our unemployed workers actually sometimes, to be honest with you, act as a disincentive. And we have folks who are deciding to just wait it out. They don't want to get COVID. I'm getting this extra money right now. I'm just going to wait it out and see what happens. So as a result, we've actually seen a market slowdown in people looking for work. And needing our assistance, but at the same time, our employers are screaming for skilled workers.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think this is a good time to say, if we have any legislators listening to this right now, childcare is an economic and workforce development issue. I don't know how many times we have to say that in rural areas, but it absolutely is true. And we have heard it over and over again from all the interviews that we did for this research, that childcare is playing a significant role in people's ability to go to work. So yeah, thanks for saying that, and I appreciate that. Now, Luke, I have you on because you do a lot of work, obviously in Southwest, but also in Central Minnesota. In Central Minnesota, when we looked at the data, really is an outlier when we look at all the regions outside of the 7-county metro. Central Minnesota had a high number of unemployment and a lower number of jobs available. But that's really because of its link and association to the 7-county metro. So a lot of folks that live in Central Minnesota work in the 7-county metro, got laid off from a job in the 7-county metro, but it counts as unemployment for Central Minnesota, right? So those numbers, the data actually kind of looks a little weird and doesn't work quite right in Central Minnesota. So I was wondering if you could provide maybe just a little bit of context into what are you actually seeing on the ground? What does that look like? And how does the data represent and not represent the region very well?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kelly. It's a bit wonky because Central Minnesota wraps around the western suburbs and northern kind of collar counties of the Twin Cities. So there's a lot of commuting going into the Twin Cities. And just like you said, if somebody's filing for unemployment insurance and they're residing in Central Minnesota, that unemployed person, is receiving services and needs assistance in Central Minnesota. Yet, if they are unemployed because their job was lost, that job loss is counted against its location, which would be the Twin Cities. So if you look at unemployment, it appears Central Minnesota is high, but if you look at actual job loss that occurred in the second quarter of last year, it actually fared a little better, fared pretty well. I would say one of the more unique things about Central Minnesota is, its industry base is different than the Twin Cities by a long shot. There's a lot of rural areas. So agriculture is heavy kind of on the western side, accommodation and food and entertainment industry is big kind of in the northeast, and in the central, that's really where you're strong into healthcare and manufacturing. So, in kind of this whole idea that employers are struggling to find people and yet there's massive amounts of unemployment, to me, it really just fits the picture of the economic landscape. Because when I look at the hardest hit sectors within Central Minnesota, I see accommodation and food services. So it fared a little bit better than it did overall for the state, but still, massive amounts of layoffs. That's really in every single area of the state. That's probably the industry of most concern just because it's been hit the hardest with executive orders. It's struggled to, maintain operations and keep people safe and mitigate consumer preferences. But in central Minnesota, then, we have construction. It's a large industry in the area. It's not by far the biggest, but it had been one of the fastest growing industries. It actually showed some growth this year. And if you think about, kind of like that growth we saw in construction, it would appear on paper that folks being laid off from accommodation and food services would be an excellent fit to fill construction vacancies. So accommodation and food declined by about 39% in the second quarter of last year compared to the previous year, but construction actually grew by almost 2%, one of the only industries to grow in the area. But if you think about taking somebody out of a fast food restaurant and giving them a tool belt and a hammer, or trying to get them to plumb or install HVAC equipment, I mean, the skills gap is just insurmountable. You can't turn people around and provide them with skills that quick. Wages are better in construction. The availability of full-time work is better in construction, but it doesn't necessarily mean we can just funnel people into those. So in central Minnesota, like I said, it's overrepresented in healthcare, but healthcare actually fared better than it did across the state. And a lot of that's just the type of healthcare that there is. Central Minnesota is a hub in the hospital network. So they actually did quite well. Whereas, like in Southwest, for instance, we saw some pretty big declines in their hospital, which is tough on a rural hospital network, and particularly the social assistance aspect, which is mainly vocational rehab services. And just like what Carrie and Vicki were talking about, these available workers that we have not necessarily being interested in joining the labor force or dropping out and just kind of sitting on the sidelines, that's also happening with folks with disabilities. I was talking to a vocational rehab counselor, and our department houses the voc rehab services, and there's been a huge change up there in demand for their services, just because there's different types of benefits available for people that are laid off, changing the incentives, and the people that are scared to go back and join the labor force, they're going to sit on the sidelines. The ones that aren't scared, that do believe that they can work in a safe environment, or go to work without risking their life, or whatever their personal stance is, huge opportunity. In some of the biggest areas that we've had layoffs, that's really where we see the job postings, because a lot of this is such temporary and volatile that as companies are laying off, there's others that are hiring. And I would say, again, that accommodation and food service has been the biggest challenge. Their jobs are nearly impossible to work remotely. And so they don't really probably have the same problems with broadband that other types of companies have, aside from maybe the consumers not being able to order online or things like that. But, as far as what can we do, or maybe where is areas that could improve things, I would definitely echo the broadband availability. That's something I've heard from every single sector of organizations. They're workers that are working from home. A lot of them are thriving if they have solid broadband availability. And to me, it's really just kind of leapt forward this importance that we placed on it. Maybe 2 years ago, we looked at it as a nicety, and now it's a necessity. To me, I don't know how you could look at it any differently than the rural electric project that came through and electrified rural America, about a century ago.
Yeah, sometimes it takes something as extreme as a pandemic to really put in focus the priorities that we need to have, and how essential some things are. That, we've had discussions about broadband. Is it really a necessity, or is it just something nice to have? And here comes the pandemic and shines a bright light on, like, yep, it's a necessity. It's definitely utility. So we've had a lot of conversation here. talking about kind of workers kind of staying on the sidelines, and sometimes that can come off as like a negative connotation. And I feel like, just so we all know, or just so our audience knows, like there are some legitimate reasons why people are kind of sitting on the sideline waiting this thing out, that are totally legitimate. But one thing that was interesting when we were doing interviews for our research on this was hearing from a lot of folks on the ground about some timing issues. So what happens when they decide to enter back into the labor force? And what happens when they decide to start utilizing our workforce development boards and deeds programming to start entering into the workforce? Because when we look at projections, right, projections don't look good for occupations that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. So people that have been in food preparation, serving related, sales related, those type of occupations aren't going to recover super quick. And so we're probably going to have a lot of people with those occupations and skill set with not a lot of job opportunities for them. So they're probably going to have to need some retraining. So Carrie, or let's start with Vicki this time. Vicki, in your guys' organization, when do you feel like, is this going to be like a summer thing? Like you feel like, oh, you might start seeing a lot of people come through your door? And what does that look like for your organization? Because, from what I've heard, you're dealing with employers. You have one arm out trying to help employers find employees, but then you have this outreach and engagement with unemployed and dislocated workers. So how does that look for your organization? Any idea looking in the crystal ball a little bit?
We will be seeing retraining needs, but I think it's also important that we strengthen, if we can, the infrastructure of our career force centers, because we're going to be seeing a lot of people coming in needing basic assistance with just getting back to work. Some of those, a lot of those skills are transferable. For example, the customer service oriented businesses lend well to sales and that sort of thing. So we are expecting to see, especially as the vaccine gets more generally available and that sort of thing, people coming back. So we need both. We need both the ability to get people back into work quickly for the jobs that are available, and also the ability to be able to train and upskill or completely reskill. And we're ready for that. We have been serving people all along. We've never completely closed, although we've been serving people differently. I think it's very important that we do understand the skills gap. And we've been talking about that before, and Luke did a great job, thank you, Luke, of explaining it. But yes, there are a lot of unemployed people out there, but they don't necessarily have the skills that our employers are looking for. And that's where we really have to fine tune and make sure that we're, identifying the round peg that goes in the round hole, and being able to train for what is actually needed by our employers. And it is driven by those skills. You can have all kinds of people who are begging for jobs, but if they don't have the skills the employers need, they're still going to be begging for jobs. So training is absolutely important. But again, I want to emphasize that it has to be the right kind of training at the right time.
Carrie, in Southwest now, I imagine, due to maybe a little bit lower levels of unemployment and things like that, have you guys been seeing a lot of folks kind of come through your virtual doors that are unemployed seeking work, or are they still not as much as you would think right now, and you're kind of waiting out and seeing if they'll come a little bit later?
We have not seen an influx of individuals coming into our location, and I think that's true across the state, that individuals aren't necessarily seeking out services right now. Our services, I once heard it explained like this, you really don't see the advertisements for a refrigerator until you need a refrigerator. So I think kind of what is happening is people aren't interested at this point in returning. They've decided they're not going to return to the workforce, and so they're not seeking out the services to help them. So I'm trying to encourage, and now's the time to get the reskilled training, because you don't become trained overnight. It's generally depending on the classes that you participate in or the occupation that you're seeking skills in, it will take a year sometimes or more to get the skills that you need for employers. So just really working hard to get the message out that if you are unemployed, there's resources for reskilling and training available to you. Now's the time to invest your time in that. But we sometimes run into challenges too with that. For example, CDL drivers is one of the most in-demand jobs in our region. And out of a 14 county area, we have one area that offers the training, and they have limited number of hours available for behind the wheel instruction. So really trying to work with employers to figure out alternatives to helping people get the credentials that they need too, that lead to higher paying wages. So, I mean, on the training side, you have our community colleges sometimes struggling with being able to have the instructors that they need and offer the courses that match up with the occupations that are in demand too. So there's a lot of factors that kind of go into this, into ensuring that we have successfully are training people in the careers and occupations in demand. But we are making progress, and we're ready and problem solving, and employers are at the table to help facilitate that.
So both Vicki and Carrie, you both have alluded to this kind of, it needs to be the right training. It needs to be, maybe a little different than how we're doing it now. What do you feel like are some of the changes that that are needed within the workforce development system as a whole to make access to training better, to make it faster, to make it more flexible to meet the needs of the region? It was a common theme that I heard of, just like there's a little bit of underlying frustration that we just can't move quick enough. And there's some legitimate reasons, like you brought up, Carrie. Our technical colleges just don't have the faculty to do it, right? Or they have to find somebody, and then sometimes bureaucracy gets in the way and things like that. But I'd be curious from your two perspective, and we'll start with you, Carrie, kind of, what do you feel like are some of the changes that might be really useful at a time like this?
We're finding that particularly, in the industries that are having the larger numbers of individuals who are laid off, they're usually, their wages are typically a little bit lower because they don't necessarily have the skills that lead the trained skills that lead to higher wages. And so what often happens for those individuals is they feel like they're in this position of either I have to work or I have to go to school. And being able to have time to do both when they have basic needs they have to meet often creates a barrier for them to engage in education and skills training that lead to those higher wages. So I think if we could create incentives for employers to really engage in sort of hiring individuals so they can they get wages coming in and they can meet their basic needs, and at the same time we facilitate and help those individuals get skilled training I think that's how we'll be able to really address any employment disparities, as well as it'd be one of the strategies to address employment disparities, as well as really build up that skilled labor base, that work and learn kind of model. And a lot of times people point to apprenticeships, and that model is really great. But when working with our smaller employers in Greater Minnesota or in our region, the employers maybe have 25 employees, 50 employees, and they just don't have the capacity to facilitate a formal apprenticeship type program. So the more we can do to help smaller employers facilitate these type of programs, I think it'll be a win-win for both the employers and the employees.
Thanks, Carrie. A lot of great little nuggets in there. Super insightful. I appreciate that. That's something I hope legislators hear and can think about some more. Vicki, what's your perspective?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Carrie, actually. I think it is important to provide support for employers. We have actually seen in our area, because of the labor shortage, where employers are increasing their wage offering in order to attract additional, workers. But I wanted to go back to the idea that Carrie was talking about. At Rural Minnesota SEP, we call that on-the-job training, and it is one of the most perfect partnerships I think that we can find. And so more support and more funding for on-the-job training or even apprenticeships, I think would be very helpful. To help explain what that is that we might have a person who is interested in a certain industry, whatever it may be, and we have an employer who's looking for workers. But that person might not have exactly the skills needed, or maybe the skills that are particular to that business. So what we will do then is we'll combine the worker with the employer. We will pay half of those wages while the employer is fine-tuning that training for the employee, with the expectation, of course, that if all things work out, they hire them on a permanent basis. It is such a win-win situation. The other area I think that needs additional attention is more funding for incumbent worker training. Again, as Carrie mentioned, the majority of employers are small businesses. And those are the folks that are getting hit. And they can't always afford to completely put their employees through certain training, the traditional training methods. But if there's certain things that are happening, for example, a new piece of equipment has been developed and we need to train our people on it, we can usually get that in partnership with our technical colleges up and going fairly quickly. But we are currently limited in how much of our dollars that we can utilize for that purpose. But there you have the win-win of marrying and partnering with our current college system, with our current employer system, and with our current workforce development system. And you're able to make that work in a very fast way, very quick way for the workers. And workers do appreciate getting trained quickly. As Carrie mentioned, they don't always have time to be able to work and go to school at the same time. Believe me, my educational pursuits took me many years because I was a full-time worker and a full-time mom going to school at night, and it took a while, and it is not easy.
Well, Luke, you're with Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. I know you guys are having tons of conversations about some of the programming DEED. Anything that you know of that DEED is kind of adapting to or changing as far as retraining and helping some of our workforce development organizations do their work?
Yeah, that's a good point, Kelly. So, DEED plays kind of a supportive role. At least that's the way I like to think of it, to the workforce development boards. They're really the ones that are in the thick of it, serving the customers and interacting with employers on such a large scale all across the state, and it's stratified by size. So they have small employers and large employers. So I certainly rely heavily on Carrie and Vicki and their counterparts all across the state. I would say one of the challenges that we've had leading up to this is, our economy is typically slow moving in the sense that it's slow to change. Even during the Great Recession, it might seem like the bottom fell out, but it didn't really happen all that fast. I mean, yes, there was some headline news items and things like that, but the way the labor market changes itself is it takes time, because it takes time for employers to adjust, and it takes time for employees to adapt. 2020 was just something different than what we've ever seen before. So one of the things that we've done to really try to help the workforce development boards is develop faster moving metrics. So our occupations in demand, we used to update that once a year. Now we have one that's continually updated, and that's used to inform some of the programming that the workforce development boards administer. Just so that way, if we're taking somebody, or I shouldn't say if they are taking somebody in that's unemployed and retraining them, that they're being retrained in an occupation that they're going to be successful in. Our latest occupations in demand that we just published a few months ago, we changed up the methodology to include the impacts of the pandemic, because typically at the top of the list are some of the most impacted occupations like food prep and serving workers, and those occupations are so volatile right now and in flux and just really kind of an unknown. So those are some of the things that I can see happening, I mean, they happened right away last year. We talked about that. Other parts are just difficult. Projections, for instance, are inherently challenging. And then when you add this fact, this exogenous input like a pandemic, I mean, it's just almost fruitless. Like, we have they're the best they get, but that they're not going to be right. So some things you just have to probably pay a little bit more attention to than others this year. When I was listening to Vicki and Carrie, one of the things that I was also going to mention is the whole idea of this short customized training. In our technical college network, they do a tremendous job partnering with employers to do customized training that really serves incumbent workers. And when you think of how this pandemic is really playing out and who's being impacted both economically and personally, a lot of it is older workers. They're the ones that we see dropping out of the labor force. We know that they're most at risk of COVID-19. At the same time, I remember 5 years ago, we talked about the possibility of a recession with low unemployment. And it's not because we were thinking about pandemics. That never crossed our mind, trust me. We were thinking about the baby boomers leaving the labor force. And this train was already in motion. And now we have an event that's speeding it up. And we not only have workers that need to earn income, just like Vicki, myself, I worked through college. It took me a very long time. I changed my mind a lot, probably because it took so long. I matured and started a family while in college. Matured might be an overstatement there, but so you not only have people that need to earn income at the same time, but then you also have people that are just older, right? We have fewer younger people than we used to, or at least that labor force is shifting up in demographics, I should say. So it's really likely that you're going to need to train somebody that is older. And now we have this pandemic. So, we have a lot of young people being laid off. We want to make sure we engage them. And that's one of my fears. The baby boomers, I'm not going to say give up on them. It's time for them to retire, right? Because we absolutely want them to play in the labor force as long as possible. They're the most experienced. They have great knowledge, but they've worked their whole lifetime, right? We've extracted nearly everything we can out of them in terms of their economic contributions to the labor force. Now, the young folks, people my age and younger, if they get a bad taste in their mouth for working and, maybe they don't see it as this grand prosperity contribution, that troubles me because we still need them to work the rest of their lives. And you add on top of that childcare issues, just your own health safety issues. I think it's getting a lot of people to think, is it worth it? If you're raising a family or things like that. And we want to make sure that we can do everything we can to convince them otherwise. And one of the ways we do that is to make sure that they're in an occupation that's a good fit, that they're successful. They're not lacking in training. They're not in a job that they're not satisfied with. I mean, getting them to the right job, what the workforce development boards do is going to maximize their productivity, both for the employer and their own self-satisfaction and happiness, right? And maximum productivity means maximum income for them, hopefully. So, to me, I just kind of see this as a culmination, all coming together, and it really leads to, and I'll make my final point here, adaptation. Where we see some of the biggest decline in employment is our educational services. We've seen our higher ed coming into the pandemic in dire financial situations, and yet we need them, and we need them to be more adaptable, which I don't know how that looks for funding. Can you be more adaptable with less monies? I don't know, but I do know that flexibility is going to be key because we still need them to provide some of these short-term training solutions in partnership with our workforce development boards.
Yeah, so we started talking a little bit there about projections. And Luke and I, we're we're data people. We love looking at data, and that's kind of how we see the world. And then we kind of go out and interview and be like, okay, how are we interpreting the data? Does that make sense to what's actually happening in the world? And when I was looking at projections, obviously looking forward, the occupations that were hardest hit by the pandemic will continue to have a slow recovery. So things like bars and restaurants, entertainment, recreations, things like that are going to be pretty slow to recover. But also in the projection shows a decline in occupations such as production, transportation and material moving. And that really surprised me. And when I looked at the data and I looked at previous years' projections, it has been projecting a decline in those occupations for like 10 years straight. But rural Minnesota has outperformed that in every way and has been one of the major occupations with workforce shortages. So I'm curious, Luke, what are your thoughts on the projections moving forward? Do you feel, because the projections still show that those occupations are going to be in decline, do you find that to be true, or do you feel like these projections sometimes aren't taking into account some of the unique rural aspects of the industries and the economy?
Yep, absolutely. And I will say this with any projections from anybody is when you start looking at it in even smaller rural areas, particularly rural areas, the less employment there is, the bigger risk you have for them to be off. Because think of the impact of a single employer. In the Twin Cities, it might be a blip. In Candy, Ojai County, Lyon County, right? I mean, that might make or break a 10-year projection period. If you have a new employer move in or move out, that drastically changes not only that industry forecast, but also the occupations that they employ. Think of a huge distribution center. Those seem to pop up here and there. They employ a decent amount of people. And if you don't have one of those in your area, your outlook might be kind of bleak for, logistics and forklift drivers, for instance. And you have one of those, site selectors come in, they choose your area because you have complementary industries and they pop up shop. It's probably going to fly in the face of whatever forecast you had. So that is a very big struggle. And it also makes the workforce development board in our rural areas jobs probably a little bit more challenging because they're having to respond to these changes. In central Minnesota, we had Electrolux leave. And, that is a huge void. It makes the landscape of manufacturing look entirely different than it did a year ago. Now, luckily, they, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of those workers can be absorbed back, but that wasn't in the previous projections. And that was one single company making one, very big decision about that area. But the same thing happens in Southwest, Northeast, Northwest, Southeast.
So one more question I guess I have for Carrie and Vicki. Moving ahead, how do we engage these folks that are either unemployed, dislocated, or have dropped out of the workforce moving forward? Are we going to be in a virtual setting? What does that look like? How do we connect with them? What are you guys thinking? Vicki, we'll start with you.
I think we're going to continue to be in a virtual setting. Although, when you're talking about workforce development and helping people decide what they're going to do for the rest of their lives and how to get there, it's really a personal thing. It's absolutely personal. And so we have to keep that person-centered orientation. And technology doesn't always meet that need. So we really have to look at what I call a hybrid or a blended system. We also have to understand the factors that are involved that we've touched on earlier with workforce development in the greater Minnesota area, in the rural areas. And that is, again, the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure. I want to go back to broadband. If we're going to continue to use virtual means, which we are, we really have to concentrate on strengthening broadband throughout the rural areas. We must. And along with that goes technology training, because a lot of folks, especially in the rural areas, are simply not technologically literate. And so we need to help them with that, all the while without taking away that person-centered orientation. I think that's very, very important. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think if we can look for ways to provide return to work incentives, whether it's via the employer somehow or some other way, rather than, if I may say so, I might get in trouble for saying this, but if we continue to extend the extra assistance with unemployment or with public assistance programs who are waiving certain requirements, those are actually disincentives for people to want to come back. And so, I would rather see incentive for them to come back rather than for them to stay home. But like you said earlier, Kelly, we have to understand there are legitimate reasons why people are sidelining right now. I think that we're going to need to look at both the need for quick return to the workforce. Therefore, I spoke earlier about the infrastructure in terms of beefing up the career labs, getting more computers out there, and that sort of thing. At the same time, understanding training, both short-term and the long-term training, is going to be very important. What's important is another thing that is going to be important in the recovery is we need to get that vaccine out there and work towards herd immunity so that people are no longer afraid to go back to school for fear they'll catch COVID. Our daycares can reopen, businesses can reopen, all of those things are very important as well. I just think that funding for expansion of daycare and broadband would be very, very helpful. When you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you always look at your basic needs first. And for rural Minnesota, to me, you need daycare and you need broadband for everything else to work. So if any of you legislators are listening out there, I would really ask you to focus there, as well as on incentive. How do you say the word? Incentivizing, employers to also engage. And then lastly, one of the things that we lost during the pandemic was the technique or the process when people were going on unemployment insurance. They would usually come to an orientation at which they would learn about the dislocated worker services or the myriad of services that the career force centers can provide to them. And that has been missing with the pandemic, because we have had to, basically shut down, and the communication flow has not been as smooth as it used to be. We need to re-engage that work, even if it's virtually.
Carrie, I saw you nodding up and down quite a bit in that response. Anything that you would add?
Absolutely. I think Vicki did a great job of articulating kind of the needs. And I thought it was funny that as she was talking about the need for broadband, I got dropped from the call and had to re-engage again. So so broadband, childcare, all those things I think are really important for people to re-engage. And as Vicki mentioned too, that process of those who apply for unemployment insurance and how they were in the past connected with the workforce development system, has been changed. And in addition, the incentives around or the additional benefits around unemployment insurance, I think also is contributing to having a lack of incentive to re-engage in the workforce as well. So those things I think should be looked at, and but at the same time we have to address the needs of safety and so forth. So balancing that isn't an easy task, but I do think that we could look at that and maybe come up with some new solutions. One thing I really kind of want to emphasize or point out is that small employers in greater Minnesota are so essential. And if we don't address the recruitment of new workers and the retention of current workers for employers, these employers will leave us. I have a manufacturer in Rock County, which is right on the very southern border, bordering Iowa and South Dakota at the same time. And they're a growing company, and they have decided to build a major plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And they cited the issue for doing that as a broader workforce, a greater workforce to pull from. Now, they don't have plans at this point to change the plant that they have in Rock County, but it's very concerning to me. We've had other employers leave our region or get gobbled up by larger companies, and they cite workforce, not having the workforce that they need as a reason for doing that. And so I just continue to get concerned that we just need more people coming to Minnesota, and we, as well as the need for upskilling the folks that we have, and incentivizing people to join the labor force or rejoin the labor force. Our students, you know, when I look at the school districts that border our other states, half of those students leave our region when they graduate from, or leave the state, I should say, when they graduate from high school. We need those students. So how can we, you know, address the broader issue of retaining people in our state and recruiting more people, workers in our state? I think that broader issue will be very important for businesses to survive and to continue to grow.
Yeah, I know rural areas continue to go down this road of people recruitment and retention. So not just talking about workers, but how we just recruit people. It's a really intriguing strategy, really intriguing concepts. And there are some programs being implemented across the state that are really fun to see. So that will have to be a future discussion, I feel like, a future podcast series. Luke, I'm going to leave it to you in central Minnesota. I know you're engaged with a lot of employers and a lot of workforce development organizations as a DEED representative. Would you add anything else to what Vicki and Carrie says?
You know, they really rounded it out quite well. I think the biggest thing is going to be an increase in flexibility, and not just particularly with workforce programs, but policies of all sorts. And, you know, every community is different. The needs of every worker is different. So providing that flexibility to help businesses and workers at a local level, to me, is probably paramount. Because what works in one community and what's problematic in one community might not be in the other. Even if we're all dealing with a global pandemic that, you know, it's kind of enveloped the entire world, the needs of each community is still different. So that flexibility, you know, and I hate to just throw it out there as just a really broad generalization, but it's so important. I see it with workforce programs, you know, everything from letting restaurateurs have folks dine on their sidewalk, you know, just the scope of flexibility with our educational system, all of it. I think it just needs to be considered with every single policy that's made. You know, is this going to prevent folks from getting the training or being successful, you know?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Before we wrap up our discussion, is there anything else anyone would like to add to the discussion?
You know, there was a couple of things that I didn't get a chance to mention that I don't know if you can somehow fit it in, but number one is I want to make the point is that we are the experts. You know, there has been a lot of talk about the traditional workforce development system in Minnesota, but the truth is, if the data tells the story, you know, and if you look at our data, we are exceeding all of our expected measures, and our people know what they're doing. And again, I go back to that person-centered or person-oriented methodology of providing services, because what you do for the rest of your life is very personal. So I want to emphasize that our system works, and we have a lot of experts within that system, and it works. And the other work works. And the other piece that I wanted to mention is the innovativeness of Minnesotans. You know, when the pandemic hit, we had to pivot very, very quickly to be able to continue to provide services to all of our stakeholders, customers, employers, clients alike. But so did our businesses. And for example, in our area, we have a famous clothing manufacturer that started producing masks when their, you know, regular t-shirt and sweatshirt line weren't moving as quickly. We've had plastic manufacturers switch over to making the plexiglass shields or the face shields. We've had breweries and wineries switch over to making sanitizers. So they were able to continue to produce, and they were able to continue to employ. So I think it's important for our legislators somehow to hear those stories too.
Well, Vicki, Carrie, Luke, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciated this conversation. Anybody listening on the podcast, I highly encourage you, if you're looking for more information, contact your local career force department to connect with either a regional analyst from DEED or one of your workforce development boards. These guys are the specialists in your region to help either connect you to jobs or connect you with more information. If you're a legislator and you want to know what's going on in your region, these are the folks you talk to. They know more than I do. And so please do that. And again, Carrie, Luke, Vicki, thanks so much, you guys. I really, really appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in